Between February 2022 and late 2025, European Union member states and EU institutions have committed approximately $90–100 billion in total aid to Ukraine, military equipment, economic support, humanitarian assistance, and budget financing. That's roughly $90,000 transferred from European taxpayers to support Ukraine's survival against Russian invasion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire annual GDP of countries like Luxembourg or Croatia. That's the equivalent of building 20+ major European high-speed rail networks. That's more money than Europe spent on any single foreign policy initiative in decades. And here's what almost nobody saw coming as we close out 2025. This unprecedented aid commitment, combined with energy crisis costs, defense spending increases, and inflation-fighting measures, has pushed multiple European member states into severe budget crises that are now threatening to trigger another round of European fiscal conflicts, reminiscent of the Eurozone crisis of 2010–2012. Let me show you exactly what's happening, because the numbers reveal the scale of the budget problems. Germany, throughout 2022–2025, has provided approximately $28–30 billion in Ukraine aid, the largest European contributor. But Germany, throughout this same period, has also dealt with energy crisis costs exceeding $100 billion for subsidies and relief programs, plus massive increases in defense spending toward 2% GDP target, requiring $30–40 billion annually, above previous levels. Total additional German fiscal costs from Ukraine war and related consequences throughout 2022–2025 exceed $200 billion. Germany entered this period with relatively low debt, around 60–65% of GDP. By late 2025, German debt has risen to approximately 66–68% of GDP. Not catastrophic, but moving in wrong direction when German constitution requires balanced budgets under normal circumstances. Throughout late 2024 and into 2025, Germany's constitutional court has struck down various government borrowing schemes as violating debt limits. German government throughout 2025 has been scrambling to find budget cuts or constitutional workarounds to continue funding commitments, including Ukraine aid. France, throughout 2022–2025, has provided approximately $10–12 billion in Ukraine aid. But France entered this period with high debt, already around 110% of GDP, and structural deficits. French spending on energy relief, defense increases, and general government programs throughout 2022–2025 has pushed French deficit to approximately 5–6% of GDP by late 2025, well above the 3% limit that EU fiscal rules theoretically require. French government throughout 2025, under both Macron and subsequent political leadership, has been warned by EU Commission about excessive deficits and has been scrambling to cut spending while facing domestic political pressure to maintain social programs. Ukraine aid is relatively small part of French budget problems, but symbolically significant as voters question foreign spending during domestic fiscal stress. Italy, throughout 2022–2025, has provided approximately $8–10 billion in Ukraine aid. Italy entered this period with debt around 145–150% of GDP, second highest in Europe after Greece. Italian borrowing costs throughout 2023–2025 have been elevated as bond markets worry about Italian debt sustainability. Throughout 2025, Italy has faced pressure from EU to reduce deficits while also maintaining Ukraine support and increasing defense spending. Italian government, led by Meloni throughout 2025, has been balancing competing demands for fiscal restraint and continued support for various policies, including Ukraine. Add in Poland, $10–12 billion aid, Netherlands, $5–7 billion, Spain, $4–6 billion, Belgium, Austria, Czech Republic, and other European countries, plus EU institutional aid, $35–40 billion from various EU funding mechanisms, and you get to the $90–100 billion total European commitment throughout 2022–2025. Now, let me explain why this aid, combined with other war-related costs, has triggered budget crises across multiple member states. The aid itself is manageable for Europe's $15+ trillion collective economy. 90, 100 billion over 3 to 4 years is roughly 0.7% of European GDP cumulatively. Large amount in absolute terms, but not economically devastating. The problem throughout 2024-2025 is that Ukraine aid came on top of multiple other massive fiscal pressures. Energy crisis relief costing European governments $500 billion collectively throughout 2022-2024 to cap consumer prices and support businesses facing high energy costs. Defense spending increases, adding $80 billion annually across Europe as countries race toward 2% GDP targets and rearm in response to Russian threat, inflation fighting measures, including various subsidies and support programs costing tens of billions, economic slowdown reducing tax revenues throughout 2023-2024 as high energy costs and inflation weakened growth. Each of these individually would be manageable. Together throughout 2022-2025, they've created fiscal pressures that are unprecedented outside of wartime mobilization or financial crisis response. And Europe is trying to manage these pressures while maintaining normal social programs, welfare states, and government services. Throughout late 2025, the accumulated fiscal stress is manifesting as budget crises in multiple countries simultaneously, something that hasn't happened since 2010-2012 Eurozone crisis. Let me show you what specific budget crises look like across European states in late 2025. Germany, throughout November-December 2025, has been engaged in intense political battles over budget after constitutional court rulings constrained borrowing. Coalition government throughout late 2025 has been negotiating spending cuts versus tax increases versus constitutional changes to allow more borrowing. Discussions throughout German budget crisis in late 2025 have included whether to reduce Ukraine aid, whether to slow defense spending increases, whether to cut domestic social programs, all politically toxic options. German parliament throughout December 2025 has been deadlocked on budget, raising possibility of political crisis or new elections. France throughout 2025 has faced even more severe pressures with deficit around 5.6% of GDP triggering EU excessive deficit procedures. French government throughout 2025 has proposed spending cuts of $60 billion over several years to bring deficit back toward 3% limit. French political chaos throughout 2024-2025 with snap elections and unstable coalition governments has made budget reform nearly impossible. French parliament throughout late 2025 has struggled to pass budgets as different political factions refuse compromises. Italy throughout 2025 has been navigating between EU pressure for fiscal consolidation and domestic political demands for continued spending. Italian government throughout 2025 has proposed modest deficit reduction but faces bond market pressure as Italian debt yields remain elevated around 4 to 4.5%, adding billions to annual debt service costs. UK, while outside EU, faces similar pressures with high debt around 100% of GDP and large deficits. UK throughout 2025 has provided significant Ukraine aid, 12 to 15 billion, while dealing with domestic fiscal pressures from energy crisis and economic weakness. Netherlands, traditionally fiscally conservative, throughout 2025 has faced unexpected deficit increases due to Ukraine aid, defense spending, and economic slowdown. Dutch government throughout 2025 has been debating spending cuts versus accepting higher deficits. Subscribe to this channel if you want continued coverage of European fiscal crisis developments through 2026, because mainstream coverage fragments the story rather than showing the systemic nature of budget pressures across multiple member states simultaneously. Now let me explain what the political consequences are of budget crises coinciding with Ukraine aid commitments. Right-wing populist parties across Europe throughout 2024-2025 have been exploiting budget pressures to question Ukraine aid. Argument is, why are we sending billions to Ukraine when our own citizens face high prices, reduced services, and budget cuts? This argument throughout 2025 has been gaining political traction even in countries traditionally supportive of Ukraine. Poland, which has been massive Ukraine supporter, has seen political debates throughout 2025 about whether Poland can continue massive aid levels given domestic budget needs. Germany throughout 2025 has seen Alternative for Germany, AfD party, which opposes Ukraine aid, polling at record highs around 15-20% nationally and even higher in eastern states. AfD throughout 2025 has been using budget crisis to argue for cutting Ukraine aid and redirecting funds to German priorities. France throughout 2025 has seen both far-right National Rally and far-left France Unbowed questioning Ukraine aid levels, arguing that billions sent abroad should address French poverty and crumbling infrastructure. Italy's government, led by Meloni, while officially supporting Ukraine, has faced pressure throughout 2025 from parts of coalition that question aid levels, given Italian debt problems. This political pressure throughout 2024-2025 hasn't yet resulted in major aid cuts. European governments have maintained commitments, but political sustainability is questionable if budget crises deepen in 2026 and populations increasingly question foreign spending during domestic fiscal stress. Let me show you what EU institutional tensions are resulting from member state budget crises. EU fiscal rules theoretically require deficits under 3% of GDP and debt under 60% of GDP. Throughout 2020-2023, these rules were suspended due to COVID and then energy crisis. Rules were partially reactivated in 2024-2025, but with significant flexibility. Throughout 2025, EU Commission has been trying to enforce fiscal discipline on countries with excessive deficits, France, Italy, and others, while acknowledging that strict enforcement during energy crisis and Ukraine war would be politically impossible. This creates tension throughout 2025 where rules exist but aren't enforced, undermining credibility of fiscal framework. Fiscally conservative countries like Netherlands and Austria throughout 2025 have complained that rules are meaningless if they're never enforced. Fiscally stressed countries like France and Italy throughout 2025 have argued that rules are too rigid and prevent necessary spending on defense and Ukraine support. EU throughout late 2025 is caught between these positions with no clear resolution. Proposed reforms to fiscal rules throughout 2024-2025 have been debated but not finalized, leaving system in limbo. Financial markets throughout 2025 have been watching these tensions nervously. Bond yield spreads between German bonds and Italian or French bonds have widened throughout 2024-2025, suggesting markets see increased risk of fiscal problems in peripheral European countries. If spreads widen further in 2026, if Italian bonds yield 5-6%, while German bonds yield 2-3%, it could trigger 2010-2012 style sovereign debt crisis concerns requiring ECB intervention. Now let me explain what happens if budget crises force aid reductions in 2026. European governments throughout 2025 have made multi-year commitments to Ukraine. Germany committed to providing $7 to $8 billion annually through at least 2027. France, UK, and others made similar multi-year pledges. If budget crises force these commitments to be reduced in 2026, Ukraine faces severe problems. Ukrainian state budget for 2025 is approximately $70-80 billion, with roughly $40-45 billion coming from international aid, including $35-40 billion from Europe and US. If European aid falls from current levels, Ukraine faces budget shortfall that would require massive domestic cuts or printing money, causing inflation. Ukrainian military operations throughout 2026 could be constrained if European military aid declines due to budget pressures. Artillery ammunition, air defense systems, vehicles, weapons all depend heavily on European supplies. Reduced flow would directly impact Ukrainian battlefield capabilities. European security more broadly throughout 2026-2030 could be undermined if budget crises prevent necessary defense spending increases and Ukraine support. If Europe can't simultaneously support Ukraine, increase own defense spending, and maintain fiscal stability, choices will have to be made that leave Europe vulnerable. Russian strategy throughout 2026 will likely focus on outlasting European fiscal capacity to support Ukraine. If Russia believes European budget pressures will force aid reductions, Russia has incentive to prolong conflict until European support weakens. Let me tell you what specific 2025 developments revealed the budget crisis emerging. In November 2024, Germany's Constitutional Court struck down government plan to repurpose $60 billion in unused COVID funds for climate and infrastructure, declaring it violated debt brake rules. This triggered German budget crisis that has continued throughout 2025. In June 2025, EU Commission issued formal warnings to France and several other countries about excessive deficits, initiating procedures that theoretically could lead to sanctions, though sanctions have never been imposed historically. Throughout summer 2025, multiple European countries announced budget reviews and spending cut proposals as they grappled with deficits larger than anticipated due to economic slowdown and accumulated spending pressures from previous years. In September 2025, Italian bond yields spiked above 4.5% briefly as markets worried about Italian fiscal trajectory combined with political uncertainty. ECB indicated readiness to intervene if necessary, but haven't had to act yet. Throughout fall 2025, multiple European finance ministers gave speeches warning about fiscal sustainability and the need for spending discipline, even while maintaining commitments to Ukraine and defense. These developments throughout 2025 reveal that budget crisis isn't single event, but accumulating pressure across multiple member states that could trigger coordinated crisis in 2026, if not managed carefully. Now let me show you what the actual math is on whether Europe can afford continued Ukraine support. Europe's collective GDP is roughly $15 to $16 trillion. Current Ukraine aid of $25 to $30 billion annually is approximately 0.2% of European GDP. This is objectively affordable. European defense spending increases toward 2% GDP targets represent roughly $50–80 billion annually in additional spending beyond previous levels. This is 0.5% of GDP, also affordable. Energy crisis relief that cost $300–500 billion throughout 2022-2024 is mostly behind Europe now as prices have moderated and temporary relief programs have ended. Adding everything up, Europe, in theory, can afford Ukraine aid, defense increases, and normal government operations without fiscal crisis. The problem is political, not economic. European governments throughout 2025 are struggling to convince domestic populations to accept that supporting Ukraine is worth the costs when households face inflation, businesses face uncertainty, and public services face budget pressures. The fiscal arithmetic works if Europe wants it to work. The political arithmetic is much harder, especially with populist parties exploiting budget tensions to gain support by opposing foreign aid. Let me explain what I personally think is happening. Europe throughout 2022-2025 has made morally correct and strategically necessary decision to support Ukraine massively. $90–100 billion in aid has helped Ukraine survive Russian invasion and prevented Russian conquest that would threaten European security directly. But Europe throughout 2022-2025 has struggled to communicate to domestic populations why this spending is necessary and worth short-term budget pressures. Political leaders throughout 2024-2025 have been defensive about aid levels rather than making affirmative case that supporting Ukraine prevents much larger future costs if Russia succeeds. Budget crises throughout late 2025 are partly real fiscal pressures from accumulated costs of energy crisis, defense increases, and aid commitments. But they're also partly political crises where governments lack consensus and credibility to make necessary fiscal adjustments. If European politics functioned better, if governments could pass budgets, enforce fiscal rules, and build public support for necessary spending, the budget pressures would be manageable. The dysfunction throughout 2024-2025 is what's turning manageable fiscal pressures into crises. Europe gave Ukraine $90-100 billion in aid throughout 2022-2025, then faced unexpected budget crisis across multiple member states in late 2025 as accumulated fiscal pressures from energy relief, defense increases, inflation, and economic slowdown combined to push deficits to levels triggering political and market concerns. Germany faces constitutional court constraints on borrowing, creating political deadlock over budget. France faces 5.6% deficit triggering EU procedures and domestic political battles over cuts. Italy faces high debt servicing costs and bond market pressure. Multiple smaller states face variations of similar pressures. As 2025 ends, European fiscal crisis is building rather than resolving. Political tensions over spending priorities, including Ukraine aid, are intensifying. Bond markets are watching nervously for signs of debt sustainability problems. EU fiscal rules remain in limbo between theoretical requirements and practical unenforceability. The trajectory toward 2026 is concerning. If budget crises force aid reductions, Ukraine suffers directly. If fiscal tensions trigger bond market panics, Europe could face 2010-2012 style sovereign debt crisis. If political dysfunction prevents necessary fiscal adjustments, both Ukraine's support and European fiscal stability could be threatened simultaneously. Europe gave the aid. The budget crisis emerged, and 2026 will determine whether Europe can maintain support for Ukraine while managing fiscal pressures, or whether budget constraints force the kind of aid reductions that Russia is hoping for, and that would undermine European security for decades to come.